Good morning. It is now 10:45, so I will get started. If this is your first morning joining us, my name is Bart Pushaw. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the University of Maryland. And I am the sort of, main person who has been kind of nerding out and excited about these Baltic Sea art connections for quite some time. And the sort of main kind of thrust behind the conference that we're doing over the next few days. And I wanted to sort of introduce why we're doing this conference, why now, why here in Tallinn, where we might go in the future, why have we gotten here today, why are some of these things new for many of you, but also very sort of old for others. And so to sort of introduce this idea, I wanted to start, because the conference is organized around the exhibition in the Great Hall at Kumu about symbolism, I wanted to begin with a very different kind of Baltic exhibition, which took place in Malmö in Sweden in 1914. On the day that it opened, the Swedish writer Einar Rosenborg had written about the exhibition that, quote, "The art exhibition is a total victory for its organizers. To see the best of contemporary art from Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Finland, and Russia is an occasion that has never been offered before and will most likely not be offered again in decades, if ever." Now, this exhibition, this 1914 Baltic exhibition, was primarily, of course, along the lines of these industrial exhibitions that we're used to seeing in the second half of the 19th century, early 20th century. But it is also most famous art historically because it is the moment where Vasily Kandinsky exhibits his works in Sweden, and it becomes sort of well-known beyond the German circles with which he was associated previously. And so Rosenborg has this idea, of course, of what art around the Baltic Sea region is, the countries it represents, also by the fact that, of course, he even isolates Finland as a separate entity, even though it exhibited with Russia. But on the other side of the Baltic Sea, the idea of this exhibition was actually, or the reception rather, was quite different. And the Estonian writer Gustav Sweets, who is sort of one of the most prominent intellectual figures working in the Estonian language at the beginning of the 20th century, had written a quite extensive review of this exhibition in the Estonian journal Vabad, or the Free Word. And he had sort of explained the entire exhibition and reviewed it. And at the very end, in some 5 pages, he had said, "A Baltic art exhibit, yet not a single Baltic German, Estonian, or Latvian." And so I wanted to sort of highlight these sort of dual poles of understanding, I think, this Baltic exhibition and what Baltic art was, because I think this idea that on the one hand, for this Swedish reviewer, it is sort of the best of what contemporary art is in this Baltic region, and it already includes a set panorama of countries, whereas for an Estonian person, at the exact same time, it was very obvious to him what was missing, and it couldn't sort of be unremarked. I say this because, of course, this is kind of the gap that we find ourselves in today, that when we look at symbolist scholarship and we look at especially the rise of symbolist scholarship and exhibitions since the early 90s, that you almost rarely, if ever, find any works by artists from the Baltic states. And of course, the one exception is Mikalojis Čiurlionis. But the most recent time in which, or really the only time in which Baltic art has been more involved in this was, of course, like Dr. Gerhard Uppenit talked about yesterday, was the Swedish exhibition about symbolism and decadence that took place in Stockholm just a few years ago. And so I emphasize this because really when we look at many of these exhibitions, which are supposedly very pan-European and international, it seems that the Baltic states, for some odd reason, are always sort of left out and sort of unknown, which I say is not necessarily the case that these artists or artworks are sort of inaccessible, because of course at the exact same time that we have a rise in symbolist scholarship internationally, there is of course a rise in symbolist scholarship in the three countries. And not only that, of course, but also the fact that many of these exhibition catalogs on Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian art are also published and available in languages besides their native Baltic languages. So even Dr. Lamberga's exhibition on symbolism and Art Nouveau that took place in Riga in 2000 also traveled to Prague. Laima Laučaitė's volume on art in Vilnius at the turn of the century was already also fully translated into English in 2008. There are already more catalogs on Latvian symbolism in 2010. The case is a little bit different in Estonia for various reasons we may talk about. And of course, I think most recently, most importantly, now there are entire volumes coming out in Latvia with 600 pages of entirely English text. That is really kind of incredible, and I think it attests to the fact that we really can kind of no longer use this excuse of this material somehow being inaccessible, because it has actually been quite accessible for quite some time. And also, it should also bear in mind that even as these national histories become involved, that this gathering here, when my sort of idea to focus regionally and think about the ways in which Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian artists are working, of course, with Finnish and Swedish and Polish and Russian and German colleagues, among others, that of course this is not even the first endeavor to even look at this period transnationally, that Jeremy Howard had already edited a volume about architecture at the turn of the century, which opened in a small exhibition at the Architecture Museum in Stockholm, that later came to Tallinn, focusing on many of the capitals in this region. And of course in Latvia, earlier already in 1999, there is a significant volume, a bilingual Latvian-English volume, where they consider many of these similar works under the rubric of Art Nouveau, but nevertheless focusing on the Baltic Sea countries and not only within these national parameters. So if this is not the first time that we have talked about the Baltic Sea region at the turn of the century, this is not the first time that we've had these scholarly sort of convergences, and certainly there has been accessibility of these works for quite a long time. Why is it that, unless you are a Baltic scholar, that the majority of these works right now still look or still seem so unknown or so mysterious or so incomprehensible? The main, I think, goal I wanted to sort of achieve with this conference is to begin moving away from the idea of discovery and of novelty. I think this idea plagues culture in the Baltic states much too often. I think this idea of sort of revelation, I think, was very common in the Parisian reception of the exhibition when it was at the Musée d'Orsay. Simply because there was just so much unknown, not only the names, but also the artworks. And so what I hope to do over the next few days is through these conversations we have, through listening to various scholars, focusing on these intersections and convergences among these various artists, is to begin to sort of approach, hopefully, a more sort of holistic idea of the region, of these artists, and the problems that they're working with. And I think the reason that these artists are also compelling is, especially when we look in this regional context, is because many of these works that we look at, sometimes, while their names might be unfamiliar, or their native cultures not very well known outside of their homeland, they remain, nevertheless, stylistically, obviously conversant with major trends, especially among other fellow artists. I mean, of course, when we were talking about the importance of nature, for instance, and the ways in which Parisian audiences were sort of astounded at how prominent nature featured, of course, in Baltic art, this is of course the exact same way in which Nordic art has been talked about, interpreted, and perceived since, its inception at the turn of the century. So here I just sort of highlighted that, of course, for understanding Oscar Kallis, for example, it is very common to sort of invoke the fact that many of his inspirations are very Munchian, and that sometimes these are very obvious stylistic similarities. And other times we recognize the things that are familiar, often because they come from these artists' teachers. So sometimes the very fundamental elements of where these artists are working and the different centers in which they're going, whether in St. Petersburg or in Dusseldorf, or the fact that even Oslo or Helsinki itself could be an international destination, I think, is something that is very common for Baltic art historians to think about. But I think Nordic art historians would never consider Oslo or Helsinki these international destinations and think of Helsinki and Oslo instead, in turn, these other kind of, really in these center-periphery models which seemingly never disappear. On the other hand, sometimes there are correspondences that I think are a little bit less, or a little more subtle and less unexpected. But when we sort of widen, I think, our viewpoint of what these artists might be doing and seek out these parallels, I think we also have a better and more sophisticated understanding also of artists who are still sort of underappreciated or misunderstood. On the other hand, as I emphasize these sort of similarities, there are also obviously markedly vast amounts of originality and difference. These are, of course, my token examples. If you are familiar with any of my previous scholarship, you know that I talk about these landscapes ad nauseum. They are the, I think, first things I show anyone when I talk about Estonian art abroad. I think for very obvious reasons. I think they're very obviously compelling. I personally will talk about them in more detail tomorrow. But I also wanted to emphasize, too, that when we think about what does this Baltic Sea regional idea mean in terms of symbolism, that the relationship is not always unidirectional. It's not always this connection between Latvians being inspired by Oxley-Gull and Kalala or Eero Järnevelt, but also that these Nordic and Russian and Polish artists, German artists also come here. So I think one of the best examples of this is the fact that Beda Kärnskans's canvas, Everywhere a Voice Invites Us, is actually was painted on the island of Vormsi off the coast of Estonia. And in Finland, this painting is a relatively common work in terms of Finnish symbolist art. And it was included, I think, in that Symbolist and Decadence exhibition in Stockholm, which also had the Latvian material. And when Kärnskans painted this, it was because she was entranced by the idea of these small island communities that had retained this ancient way of speaking Swedish off the coast of Estonia. And so there are ways in which even untangling and realizing these connections and just thinking the fact that these artists also travel within the region and that their travels are not always to Paris or to Rome or other places, and that these intra-regional connections are just as important, and that the treasure trove, I think, of archival material is really kind of only now beginning to be unfurled. So I hope that over the next few days, our conversations will allow this kind of dialogue. And for this reason, we also had planned the conference to focus this time on highlighting Baltic scholarship.